When we lived in Colonial Times, pages 6 to 15. When were Colonial Times? Colonial Times were a long time ago. Colonial Times began about 70 years after Columbus discovered America. They began when some settlers came from Spain to live in a colony in America. That was in the year 1565. Colonial Times ended when the 13 English colonies became the United States. That was in the year 1776. This book does not tell about all the years that made up the Colonial Times. It does not tell about all the 13 colonies. Look at the timeline at the bottom of this page. The part that is in color shows the years this book is about. Look at the map. The part that is in color is the New England. This book is about life in the New England colonies. What was it like to live then? Did boys and girls in colonial times do the same things that you do today? Did they go to school? Did they have to worry about table manners? What did they do on Sundays? What games did they play? What happened if they got sick? This book tells you. It also tells you about their work, their food, their houses, and their clothes. This book will help you imagine what it was like to be a girl or boy in colonial days. What did colonial people look like? When you look in the mirror, you see you. If you lived in colonial days, you would look the same as you do now, but you would wear your hair in a different way, and your clothes would be different too. Even baby clothes were different then. Clothes in colonial days had different names. If a baby fell, he fell right on his pudding. A pudding was a soft pillow worn around the baby's middle to keep him from getting hurt. When boys and girls were 6 years old, they stopped wearing baby clothes. From that time on, they dressed just like their mothers and their fathers. Where did people buy their clothes? Most people in colonial days did not buy their clothes anyplace. Most people made all their own clothes. They planted flax to make linen thread. They raised sheep to get wool. Everybody in the family helped to make the clothes. Grandmother's job was to card the wool. The children gathered flowers and berries and roots to make the dyes to color the yarn. People wore bright colored clothes in colonial days: yellow, red, purple, blue. Girls wore bright red cloaks with hoods. Boys wore colored stockings and caps. Girls and boys went to the woods and brought home armfuls of goldenrod and birch bark to make yellow dye, pokeberry to make red, iris to make purple, logwood to make blue. The dye was boiled in the biggest pot in the house. The children stirred the dye with a long stick so it wouldn't get lumpy. Girls and women worked at the spinning wheel. Girls learned to spin when they were 6 years old. Younger sisters helped too. They learned how to knit as soon as they could hold a pair of knitting needles. Girls of 4 could knit stockings and caps. Boys and men did their share of work. Their job was to weave cloth on a loom. Then the women took the cloth and made clothes for the whole family. All the sewing was done by hand. Was there special time for making clothes? The time for making clothes was all the time. People worked whenever they could. When the boys took the sheep to the fields, they took along a small loom. Then they could weave while they watched the sheep. When the women went visiting, they brought their spinning wheels along. They tied the spinning wheel to the back of their horse. Then they could spin while they visited, and no one could say that they were wasting time. How did they wear their hair? Girls kept their hair covered all the time, even in the house. They wore hats and hoods or kerchiefs. Boys had long hair. When wigs came into style, most men and even some boys in the big towns wore them. They wore wigs made of real hair and wigs made from the tails of cows. They wore horsehair wigs and goat hair wigs. They even wore wigs made of wire. Some men put white powder on their wigs. On a windy day, the powder blew away like snow. What did people eat? Corn, 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 and more corn. Boiled corn, roasted corn, corn ground into cornmeal and baked into corn cake and corn pudding. The Indians taught the people how to plant corn and how to cook it. If there was nothing else to eat, the people could always count on corn. But there were other things to eat. The people planted pumpkin and squash in the Indian way. The Indians showed them how to get maple sap from the maple trees. From the sap, they made maple sugar and maple syrup to sweeten their foods. There were no grocery stores in early colonial times, no place to buy food. The people planted vegetables and fruit seeds that came all the way from Europe. They planted beans and trained them to climb up the corn stalks. They cooked the beans into a mush or porridge. And they ate bean porridge, hot bean porridge, cold bean porridge, and bean porridge in the pot, 9 days old. The men and boys fished. They came home with lobsters, clams, and many other kinds of fish. The men and the boys hunted. They came home with rabbits, squirrels, bear, and deer. Some families kept a few pigs so they could have bacon and pork and sausage. During the cool days before winter, everybody worked extra hard. They had to get all their food ready for the cold months ahead. Meat was smoked, salted, and pickled. Apples and pumpkins and peaches were peeled and sliced and hung up to dry. Later, they would be cooked into stews or made into jams. No one would be hungry. No one would be thirsty either. There were not many cows in early colonial days, so there was not much milk, and people thought water would make them sick. What did they drink? They drank cider made from the apples and pears and peaches, and they drank beer. Children drank beer too, even for breakfast. This is the end of today's lesson.